The first night she knocked, it was raining so hard it sounded like the sky was breaking apart, and when I opened the door and saw her standing there barefoot, eyes hollow and red, she didn't cry or scream or explain. She just whispered, like she was afraid the walls might hear her, "My husband is gone, can you stay here tonight?" In that moment, something in me understood that this wasn't just a request for company, it was a quiet fight against a loneliness that could swallow her whole if someone didn't step in right now. I hesitated for half a second, not because I didn't care, but because I felt the weight of what she was asking, the kind of weight that changes both lives. I grabbed my jacket, locked my door, and followed her next door, unaware that this single night would unravel grief, guilt, healing, and a bond neither of us was prepared for. Her house felt colder than the rain outside, even though the heater was on. The living room still smelled faintly of her husband's cologne, the kind of scent that lingers long after a person is gone, like a ghost refusing to leave. She sat on the couch clutching a blanket that looked too big for her, staring at a dark TV screen like she expected it to speak to her. I sat at the other end, careful not to intrude, not knowing what the rules were when someone is freshly broken. Minutes passed in silence until she suddenly said his name out loud, and it cracked the room open. She told me how he'd gone to bed with a headache and never woke up, how the doctors said, "sudden," and "nothing you could have done," words that felt empty when repeated. Her voice didn't shake at first, but when she said, "I don't know who I am without him," she folded in on herself, and I moved closer without thinking, letting her cry into my shoulder while the storm outside slowly calmed. I stayed awake all night, listening to her breathe when she finally slept, afraid that if I closed my eyes too, she might disappear into the same silence that had taken her husband. Over the next few days, I became part of her routine without meaning to. I brought groceries because she forgot to eat, took out trash she never noticed piling up, and answered the door when people came with casseroles and pity-filled eyes. She smiled politely at them, thanked them, then closed the door and collapsed again, apologizing to me as if grief were something she needed to excuse. One evening, she confessed she felt guilty for asking me to stay that first night, like she'd crossed some invisible line. I told her that sometimes surviving means asking for help even when it feels uncomfortable, and she looked at me like that idea was both terrifying and relieving. The hardest moment came when she admitted she was scared to sleep alone because the silence reminded her of the moment she realized he wasn't breathing. We sat on opposite ends of the bed that night, not touching, just existing together, proving to the darkness that it didn't get to win so easily. People started talking, as they always do. A neighbor made a comment about how often my car was parked outside her house, and for a moment, shame crept in, threatening to turn kindness into something ugly. I almost pulled away, almost decided it would be easier to leave her to grieve alone than to explain myself to a world that loves rumors more than truth. But then she told me she'd tried to spend a night alone and ended up sitting on the kitchen floor until morning, shaking and begging the quiet to stop. That's when I realized this wasn't about what others thought, it was about standing between someone and the edge they were dangerously close to falling over. I stayed, and slowly, the house began to feel less like a tomb and more like a place where healing could start, even if it came in painful, uneven steps. The night I thought everything was finally settling, she surprised me by saying, "I don't want you to stay tonight," and my heart dropped before she added, "I need to learn how to be alone, but I'm scared." That was the second hook life threw at us, the kind that pulls you forward instead of back. I told her I wouldn't stay the night, but I'd sit with her until she fell asleep, and if she needed me, I was one wall away. We talked until her eyelids grew heavy, not about her husband, but about who she was before she became someone's wife, about dreams she'd put on pause, about the strange idea that life doesn't end when someone you love is gone, it just asks you to live differently. When I left her room, my chest ached, not with fear, but with a quiet pride in her courage. Weeks passed, and the grief didn't vanish, but it softened around the edges. She started cooking again, even laughing once when she burned toast and called it a personal victory. She thanked me one afternoon, standing on her porch in the sunlight, and said, "You didn't save me, you just reminded me I could save myself." Those words stayed with me longer than anything else. I realized then that staying that first night wasn't about filling a void or replacing someone who could never be replaced, it was about showing up when someone's world collapses and sitting with them in the rubble until they can stand again. On the anniversary of her husband's passing, she knocked on my door this time, holding 2 cups of coffee, her eyes sad but steady. She said, "I don't need you to stay tonight, but can you sit with me for a while?" And as we watched the sunset in comfortable silence, I understood the true message of everything we'd been through. Sometimes love isn't loud or romantic or permanent. Sometimes it's simply choosing not to leave when someone asks you to stay, and trusting that even the deepest loss can give birth to a strength you never knew you had. The night she finally asked me not to stay felt heavier than the night she begged me to, because this time the fear wasn't loud, it was brave. She stood in her doorway holding the edge of the frame like it was the only solid thing left in her world and said, "If I don't try to be alone now, I never will." I nodded even though every instinct in me wanted to step inside and pretend she wasn't trembling. I walked back to my house, but I didn't turn on the lights. I sat on the floor near the wall we shared, listening, counting the seconds between sounds, telling myself that staying close didn't always mean staying visible. Around midnight, I heard her moving, cabinets opening, a chair scraping the floor, and my heart raced until I heard her humming softly, a broken tune but a tune nonetheless. It was the first sign that the silence no longer owned her completely. The days that followed tested both of us in quieter ways. Grief stopped screaming and started whispering, sneaking into ordinary moments, when she found one of his old shirts while doing laundry, when she reached for her phone to text him about something small and remembered she couldn't. Sometimes she'd come over just to sit at my table and drink tea without saying a word, and I learned that presence didn't require conversation. Other times she pushed me away gently, insisting she needed space, and I had to fight the urge to rescue her from pain that she needed to feel in order to heal. The hardest challenge was watching her struggle without stepping in, trusting that strength grows when someone is allowed to stand on their own shaking legs. One evening, she broke down in my kitchen, admitting she felt guilty for moments of laughter, like smiling was a betrayal to the man she loved. I told her something I'd never said out loud before, that loving someone deeply doesn't mean freezing your life at the moment they leave. I watched her wrestle with that truth, tears falling not from sadness alone but from the relief of being allowed to live again. Slowly, she began reclaiming pieces of herself, taking morning walks, planting flowers in her yard where everything had once felt dead, even talking about future plans without immediately apologizing for them. The real turning point came when she invited friends over for dinner for the first time since the funeral. She was nervous, pacing, afraid the house would feel wrong without him. I stayed nearby but out of sight, ready to help if she needed it. Laughter spilled through the windows that night, awkward at first, then warm and real, and I realized she was no longer surviving, she was rebuilding. When the guests left, she stood on her porch, breathing deeply, and said, "I did it, like a child learning to ride a bike." I smiled and said nothing, because some victories deserve silence. Months later, life didn't look the same for either of us, but it looked possible. She no longer asked me to stay the night, yet she no longer feared the dark either. On quiet evenings, we'd sit outside, sharing stories, not filling emptiness but enjoying connection. She once told me that the night she lost her husband, she thought her life had ended too. Now she knew it hadn't, it had simply changed direction. And I learned something just as powerful: you don't heal people by fixing their pain, you heal them by walking beside them until they realize they can walk on their own. The last time she thanked me, I corrected her gently and said, "You were never alone, you were just learning how to be whole again." She smiled, eyes still carrying sorrow but also light, and in that moment, the message became clear. Even in the deepest loss, kindness can be a lifeline, and sometimes staying, just for a night, just long enough, can help someone find their way back to themselves.